Good morning, everybody, boys and girls, moms and dads. We have missed 2 weeks. The first week was because of a lot of stuff going on, and the second week was just technology issues. And I'm sure you understand, especially if you're trying to learn on Zoom, online school, because sometimes it doesn't work. Anyway, to recap what we've been reading, this is The Great Escape, Book 3, in The Secret of the Hidden Scrolls. Now, if you remember way back 2 weeks ago or more, Moses and Aaron were trying to get the Pharaoh of Egypt to let the Israelites go. They had been put into slavery by the Pharaoh and the Egyptians, and they were cruelly treated. And God told Moses, well, go to Pharaoh and tell him to let my people go. Well, Moses did that, and Pharaoh said no, so with Moses' staff, he turned the Nile River into blood. And as the red circle appeared, it got bigger and bigger. This is previously on. Hurry, said Peter. The dark circle filled the Nile River. Peter scrambled out just before the circle reached them. What is it? Said Princess Shiphrah. It looks like blood, said Mary. Ah, gross! Shiphrah shuddered, and dead fish floated to the top of the river, and a strange stink filled the air. Well, fish tend to smell anyway, but dead fish smell 10 times worse. So that's what happened. But then Pharaoh had a magician, and the magician is suspicious to me. The great magician slowly clapped his hand. Nice little trick. And he grabbed a pitcher of water and he poured it on the ground, and it turned into blood. Pharaoh and the magicians turned and strolled into the palace like nothing had happened. Moses and Aaron shook their heads and walked away. The water was red, for as Peter could see. Well, that didn't go well, said Peter. Why won't your dad listen to Moses? Mary asked. He is very stubborn, said Shiphrah. He seems to listen to the magician in the purple robe, said Mary. Princess Shiphrah lowered her head and sighed. He spends more time with the great magician than with me. How long has he been helping your dad? Said Peter. For a long, long time, Shiphrah said. The great magician was around before my dad was Pharaoh. Well, his skin makes my skin crawl. And now, chapter 7, frogs everywhere. Peter woke the next morning to the sound of barking outside the window. He looked out and saw Mary and Hank playing with Shiphrah. He grabbed the bag and ran out to join them. Princess Shiphrah! The great magician shouted from the palace. It is time for school. Peter shrugged. I guess playtime is over. He's your teacher? Asked Mary. Yes, said Shiphrah. I cannot go to school, so he comes to the palace. Why can't you go to school? Asked Mary. Because I'm a girl, said Shiphrah. Mary put her hands on her hips. Well, that is not fair. Centuries ago, hundreds of years ago, girls were not allowed to go to school in many countries. Certainly not fair. Rules are rules, said Shiphrah. But you're the princess, said Peter. Can't you change the rules? Only the Pharaoh can change the rules. Well, maybe you will be Pharaoh someday, said Mary. If I become Pharaoh, said Princess Shiphrah, I will change a lot of rules. School is starting, shouted the great magician. We better go, said Princess Shiphrah. The great magician does not like it when I am late. What's he going to do to you? Said Peter. Turn you into a frog? Princess Shiphrah knelt down and hopped. Ribbit, ribbit. Right this way, Princess Frog, said Peter. They all hopped to class, even Hank the dog. As they walked into the classroom, Hank growled at the great magician. The great magician pointed at small tables lined up in the middle of the classroom. "Have a seat. Today, I will teach you about the gods of Egypt," he said. He picked up a paintbrush, dipped it in black ink, and started writing hieroglyphs on the wall. The written language in ancient Egypt was called hieroglyphs, and they're like picture symbols that might stand for whole sentences or whole paragraphs, and that's how they would communicate by writing. We don't do that now. We have letters and words and sentences, but it was way different way back then. Finally, the great magician turned back around. "How many gods are there?" Princess Shafar raised her hand. More than 100. "Correct," said the great magician. Peter raised his hand. "Go ahead," said the great magician. "I believe there is only one true God," said Peter. He felt the leather bag shake under the table. That usually means something's going on the scroll. "You sound like those Israelite slaves with their weak God," said the great magician. Peter stood and put his hands on his hip. "God is strong. He is not weak." The great magician scoffed at Peter. That means he laughed at him, he mocked him, he made fun of him. "If your God is so strong, why are there still slaves?" "Well, maybe God is waiting for the right time," said Peter. The great magician's eyes filled with anger. Imagine your eyes filling with anger. "That is enough from you," he said. "Now, back to the lesson before you confuse the princess." He turned and continued writing hieroglyphs on the wall. Mary raised her hand. "What is your question?" Mary pointed at a flag symbol at the beginning of each name. "Why is there a flag in front of every name?" "That symbol, the flag, means God," said the great magician. Mary grabbed Peter's arm. We will be back in a few minutes. Do not be long," said the great magician. "You two have a lot to learn." Peter grabbed the bag and followed Mary and Hank into the hallway. "Didn't that flag symbol look just like the one on the scroll?" said Mary. "Yes, and I think the bag shook a minute ago." Peter eagerly pulled out the scroll and unrolled it. "It is the same flag." He held the scroll up in front of them. "Look!" The scroll shook, and the flag glowed and transformed into the word God. Then the hieroglyph beside it glowed and twisted into the word is. So we have the first two words, God is. They gave each other a high five. "We solved 2 words," said Mary. Hank growled. Peter heard footsteps coming down the hall. He shoved the scroll in the bag. "What are you kids doing here?" said the captain. "We're on our way back to class," said Mary. The captain pushed them aside. "Class is canceled," he said. "Moses is back." The great magician threw down his paintbrush and grabbed his staff. "Moses is getting on my nerves." He rushed out of the palace with the captain. "Let's go," said Peter. Peter, Mary, Hank, and Shafar ran to the river. They hid behind a small boat out of view. Moses and Aaron stood beside the Nile River. Pharaoh and the magicians walked down to meet them. "God has a message for you," said Moses. Pharaoh rolled his eyes. "What is it?" "God says, 'Let my people go, and if you refuse, I will bring a plague of frogs.'" Frogs. Pharaoh crossed his arms and shook his head. Moses turned to Aaron and told him to hold his staff over the river. The blood water, still blood, bubbled and gurgled, and then frogs flooded out of the river. Thousands of frogs were hopping everywhere. Hank chased them. A slimy frog hopped on Shapara's head. She screamed and ran in circles. Girls do that, you know. The great magician clapped his hands. Nice trick, but I can do it too. There was a large fountain beside the palace. The great magician mumbled some mysterious words and waved his staff over the fountain. Everyone waited and waited, and then 2 tiny tree frogs hopped out of the fountain. Not very impressive, said Mary. It looks like God is more powerful, said Peter. The leather bag started shaking. Peter motioned to Mary, and they ran behind a palm tree, with Hank right behind them. Peter pulled out the scroll and unrolled it. The 3rd hieroglyph glowed and transformed into the word powerful. God is powerful. We have solved the first 3 words, said Peter. God is powerful. And the slimy frog hopped on top of the wall. Not the wall, the scroll. These frogs are freaking me out, said Peter. Chapter 8. The Royal Dagger. A dagger is not like a switchblade, not as big as a sword, but it is a long knife. The next day, few days, they were terrible. The Nile was still filled with blood, so drinking water was hard to find. The only way to get water was to dig in the mud next to the river and find water underground. Peter looked out the window. He felt badly for the slaves who had to work all day just to find enough water for Pharaoh, the magicians, and Shapara. Plus, it still smelled so badly. Then there were the frogs. They really got on Peter's nerves. They jumped all over everything, on his head, in his food, and even in his bed. The blood and the frogs were just the beginning of terrible things that had happened. Peter opened his adventure journal and read what he'd written over the last several days. This is what he wrote. Day 4. Pharaoh was sick of the frogs. He told Moses he would let the Israelite slaves go if Moses would ask God to take the frogs away. Moses prayed, and all the frogs went away. Now there were piles of dead frogs everywhere. Then Pharaoh changed his mind and did not let the slaves go free. You can't trust Pharaoh. Day 5. Moses and Aaron came back to the palace after Pharaoh backed out of his deal again. Aaron hit the ground with his staff, and the dirt turned to annoying, gross little gnats. It's like mosquitoes, only smaller, and they're tiny, but they bite and they cause you to itch all over. The great magician tried to do it too, but he couldn't. He kept hitting the ground with his staff, but nothing happened, so he's not such a great magician after all. He was so mad that he finally ran off away from the palace. Day 6. I thought the gnats were bad, but then this happened. Moses and Aaron showed up and asked Pharaoh again to let the Israelites go. He said no again. That guy is so stubborn. Moses held his staff in the air. Then we were surrounded by swarms of flies. Nasty, dirty flies were everywhere. Princess Shapara ran around waving her arms in the air. All this buzzing is getting on my nerves. So then Peter turned to a new page in his journal. A lot had happened that day too. After the flies were gone, Pharaoh had changed his mind yet again. But the next plague was worse yet. The Egyptians' animals all got sick and died, including Shapara's favorite camel. Peter remembered how upset she had looked when she found out. Can you imagine if Pharaoh would just let the slaves go, none of this would have happened? Peter wrote a new entry. Day 7. Pharaoh made another promise to let the Israelites go. God took the flies away, the gnats away, the frogs away, but Pharaoh broke his promise again. So an even worse plague came. The Egyptians' animals got sick and died. Joseph told me that none of the Israelites' animals have died. God is protecting his people and their animals. Hank is okay. He didn't get sick. I'm not sure how much worse it can get. Peter closed the journal. He had a hard time falling asleep that night because the plagues were getting more and more difficult. When Peter woke up the next morning, he jumped out of bed and started studying the scroll. Mary walked over and looked over his shoulder. Peter looked up at her. "We have got to solve this scroll and get out of Egypt." Peter heard a knock on the door. He quickly put the scroll and the journal in the bag. "Who is it?" "It is Shiphrah." Mary opened the door. Princess Shiphrah was a mess. Her eyes were red and she looked like she had not slept in days. "Moses and Aaron are back," she said. "Well, maybe your dad will let the Israelites go this time," said Mary. "I hope so," she said. "I do not think I can handle any more plagues." Peter grabbed his bag, and they headed out. They hid behind some large flower pots and watched as Pharaoh and the magicians walked out to meet Moses and Aaron. "Where's the great magician?" asked Peter. "No one has seen him since he ran away from the gnats a few days ago," said Princess Shiphrah. "I have not had to go to school." "Well, at least one good thing happened to you," said Peter. The bag shook. Mary gave Peter a look. He held it tight so Princess Shiphrah wouldn't notice. Peter peeked around the flower pots and saw Moses grab a handful of ashes out of a furnace. He threw them into the air. Peter watched as a strong gust of wind blasted the ashes everywhere. And aren't we doing that all over this state of California? Ashes are falling from the terrible forest fires. That's kind of a plague too, huh? The ashes landed on the Egyptians, and red and blistering boils popped up on their skin. Well, the ashes from this fire won't do that, but it sure doesn't help the air. Pharaoh and the magicians began scratching madly at the boils, and they couldn't stop. "Ouch!" shouted Princess Shiphrah. "My skin itches so badly." She ran out from behind the flower pots to show her dad. "Why do you not just let them go?" she pleaded. The magicians agreed, but Pharaoh would not listen. He would not let the Israelites go free. That's because he gets free labor from them, free work, because they don't get paid for what they do. Moses and Aaron shook their heads and walked away. Peter looked down at his arm. He didn't have any boils. He looked at Mary, and she didn't have boils, and Hank wasn't scratching either. "Let's get out of here," said Mary, and they ran into the palace. "Hold it right there!" shouted the captain. Peter, Mary, and Hank froze. "Why were you hiding out there?" said the captain, scratching furiously. Peter slowly turned around and faced the captain. "We were with Princess Shiphrah." "I do not trust you three," said the captain. He took a closer look at Peter. "Wait, why do not you have any boils?" "God protected us," said Peter. "You sound just like Moses," said the captain. "Maybe you were spying for him." "Well, it's been nice talking to you," said Peter, and he slowly backed away. "I think we'll be going now." The bag shook, and Peter held it tight. "What's in there?" asked the captain, and he grabbed the bag from Peter. Peter tried to grab it back, but the captain pulled out his sword, and Peter stepped back. "Let us see what is inside," said the captain. "Princess Shiphrah," shouted Peter, "we need your help." Princess Shiphrah came running. "What is wrong?" "I think we have spies in the palace," said the captain. He opened the bag and looked inside. "We're not spies," said Peter. "Well, maybe you are thieves," said the captain, and he pulled the great Uncle Solomon's dagger out of the bag. "It is the royal dagger." The princess looked hurt and confused. She looked at Peter. "Why did you steal it?" "Let's see what else is in the bag," said the captain. "Wait," said Peter, "I can explain." Mary gave Peter the look again, and he realized he couldn't explain. Princess Shafara lowered her head. Arrest them. The captain laid the bag on the ground and walked toward Peter and Mary. Hank, said Peter, fetch! Hank ran between the captain's legs and grabbed the bag. The captain spun around. Give me that! And he reached for Hank. Time for a karate lesson, said Mary. Looks like an easy target, said Peter. Mary ran straight at the captain, who was still bending over. She jumped in the air and did a spinning kick right to his backside, if you know what I mean. Hi-ya! Ooh! The captain fell flat on his face. The sword and the royal dagger slid across the floor. I don't think he'll be sitting down for a while, said Peter. Mary ran over and picked up the dagger. Hank, run for the river, said Peter. Don't let anyone take the bag. Princess Shafara just stood there with her mouth wide open. Mary handed the royal dagger to Shafara. This belongs to you. No, said Princess Shafara. It belongs to royalty. Mary winked at her. Like I said, this belongs to you. Princess Shafara hugged Mary tightly. Thank you. Let's go, now, said Peter. Stop, thieves! The captain shouted from the floor. And this is where we leave off till next week, where we read about the Great Sphinx and what else happens. Lots of plagues, and there might be some more plagues coming. We seem to be going through a time of plagues, meaning the fire, the smoke, the terrible heat, this coronavirus, having not school online. But you know what? God is strong and He is powerful and He will protect us. So, boys and girls, have a great weekend, and I hope you're all safe and that you are kind to one another. We'll see you next week.